"Stop! This woman is not allowed to run in Oak Ridge," the HOA police guy shouted, his gun pressed against my wife Maya's temple. He had no idea she was a Delta Force officer, still on active duty, and one quick turn was all it would take to turn him into a joke in front of the entire neighborhood. Sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom. It starts with refusing to let the unreasonable stand above your dignity. What state do you live in? Does your HOA dare to abuse power like that? That morning, the sky still shimmered with mist, and sunlight had just begun to touch the neat rows of houses in Oak Ridge. Every paving stone on the sidewalk still held moisture, reflecting light like the fragile shell of a quiet dream. The black asphalt road remained damp from the light rain the night before, and the trees along the street whispered soft sounds as the morning breeze slipped through their leaves. The scene, tidy, safe, nearly sterile, made me think it would be another ordinary morning like so many before. Maya, my wife, kept her habit of jogging every morning, steady as the heartbeat of someone trying to keep life from slipping off course. She once told me that each step helped soothe the noise inside her, as if turning unease into movement, into breath, into something she could control. To Maya, Oak Ridge wasn't just a place to live, it was a carefully considered choice, a place we believed could mend the fractures of the past, a place to start over without looking back. I remember that moment clearly. Maya stepping out the door, her athletic figure in a neat workout outfit, hair tied back, each stride strong as she moved through the early morning light. Watching her, I felt a rare sense of calm I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. But that peace, like a thin sheet of glass over still water, shattered instantly when the low, grinding hum of an engine echoed from the top of the street. I turned, and my chest tightened as I saw an old white cart rolling into view, hurriedly painted and stamped with the logo, HSD, which stood for HOA Safety Division. Forward slowly, then suddenly blocked the narrow road. It wasn't a police car, but the way it stopped, brazen and deliberate, felt like a checkpoint in occupied territory. Two heavy-set men stepped out. Black tactical vests hugged their body, bold letters stitched across their back, smirks dripping with disdain, and eyes that held a self-appointed kind of authority. I saw clearly the unhidden arrogance in their gait, the way they scanned their surroundings, like they had ownership over every step anyone took. Maya was slowing down, not yet aware of what was happening. But I, watching from a distance, saw the moment their eyes locked on her like predators, spotting prey that had wandered into their domain. One of them stepped forward and shouted, voice rough and raspy like cheap cigarettes, "Stop! Show me your papers." The words landed like a punch, breaking the silence of a neighborhood that prided itself on order and decorum. Maya froze. She turned, her gaze steady and unflinching, and I saw right away the alertness tightening in her stance. Not fear, awareness, readiness. Maya had never been easy to intimidate, but I knew she never underestimated danger, especially when it came dressed as armed stupidity. A gust of wind swept through, colder than usual. I moved quickly toward Maya, my heart pounding like something was squeezing my chest. Then, the one standing closer, the one who had given the order, pulled out a semi-automatic handgun, cold metal flashing in the sunlight, the barrel aimed squarely at Maya's temple. Everything stopped. The sounds around me vanished, leaving only the rush of wind, the hammering of my heart, and the obscene glint of the weapon in that stranger's hand. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, not in a gated, upper-class neighborhood where people pay no less than $500 a month for security, where rose bushes bloom on front lawns and flags hang for the 4th of July. But this was reality. Someone had drawn a real gun, aimed it at a woman jogging, all because of suspicion. The second man, standing to the right, was no less aggressive. Paper, now. His voice was dry as a whetstone. These two didn't need a warrant, didn't need a reason, because in this area, the HOA Safety Division had long ago claimed a kind of authority no one dared question. I glanced around. A few windows cracked open, then slammed shut, as if nothing had been seen. The residents of Oak Ridge had learned how to bow their head, how to stay silent, or at least not disrupt the order imposed by those wearing the badge of security. I kept moving forward, each step feeling heavy against the concrete. My head was a storm of anger and fear, but what kept me from losing it was Maya. She stood perfectly still, her eyes cold enough to send a chill down the spine. No pleading, no trembling. I had seen that look before, when Maya returned from covert missions in places no one wanted to talk about. The look of someone who knows the line between life and death and no longer fears it. In that moment, it was clear she would not back down. The man with the gun hadn't moved. I shouted, "Stop." My voice cracked but rang out across the quiet street. Maya lifted her chin slightly, her gaze fixed on the barrel. "You are doing something you have no right to do." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp as a blade. The words, though simple, were enough to make him pause. 1 second, 2. Then he snarled, his voice like a challenged animal. "Here. I am the authority." That was the moment I nearly lost control. I yelled, "Lower the gun. You're not the police. This isn't a prison." But what truly shook me was his crooked smile, the smile of someone who knew the rules had been broken long ago. "In Oak Ridge," he said, each word like a hammer blow, "I am the law." The gun stayed aimed, as if Maya's life were some sick game he was enjoying. I don't remember how high the sun was by then, or whether the birds were still singing. I only remember the light glinting off the gun, and the look in Maya's eyes calm, unwavering. She didn't need to say another word, because in that moment, everything was was already clear. This wasn't a random check. It was a crackdown, a test of power, a display of force by men no one held accountable. And Maya, by standing her ground, was already resisting. I saw a flicker in her eye. Not anger, but resolve. The kind of resolve that refuses to bow. I knew that if forced to choose, Maya would choose to fight, not with fists, but with dignity. She would never let them believe that holding a gun gave them control over someone else's self-respect. And if that stance came with a price, then they wouldn't walk away without feeling its cost. That morning, I understood that so-called peace only exists when we are not challenged. And I understood, too, that sometime, to preserve the most ordinary things, a morning run, a breath of free air, we must be willing to confront the most extraordinary violation. Because if we don't, Oak Ridge will forever remain a gilded cage, where the armed patrol and the people walk with their heads down. The man with the buzz cut and hate-filled eyes hurled his words like a blade at my wife. This neighborhood isn't for people like you. His voice snapped, cutting through the crisp morning air, each syllable scraping out like a sentence carved from contempt. That wasn't an offhand remark. It was a strike to the core of existence, not just aimed at Maya, but at identity, at skin color, at the right to belong that people like her have always had to prove. The morning air thickened, as if something invisible had been torn open, exposing the true face of a community that prided itself on being civilized, secure, friendly. I felt the blood rush to my temple, burning like fire, as if someone had stomped hard on my dignity. I turned to Maya. Her face didn't flinch, but I saw the spark in her eyes, cold, sharp. It was the light of someone seasoned, someone who had stood toe-to-toe with prejudice, with silencing words spoken from mouths convinced of their own privilege. And because of that, I knew this man wasn't speaking at random. His words had aim, had weight, and they were aimed squarely at Maya, at her skin, at the life she never once asked pity for. In that moment, Oak Ridge, the sweet shell people had painted over, revealed itself as a velvet prison, where order was redefined as obedience, and safety was built on the price of silence. My throat tightened for a second, but not from fear. A raw fury surged, crushing every vague worry beneath it. I growled, each word cutting like a blade. You're just HOA, not the police. My voice came out louder than I expected, as if even the air wanted to rebel. I didn't say it to scare them. I said it so those hiding behind curtains would hear, would know that not everyone was willing to bow. But the moment the words left my mouth, the buzz-cut man let out a dry, hollow laugh. The kind of laugh that sounded like he'd been waiting for that exact line just to bury it beneath the scorn he'd been feeding for years. He spat on the pavement, a move like a stamp, a sick declaration of territory, his eyes still locked on Maya, and then let the words drop out, one by one. In Oak Ridge, we are the law. That sentence landed like a hammer, needing no logic, no evidence. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact the residents here had absorbed into their bloodstream from being too familiar with so-called stability. Law, here, didn't live in the resident handbook or long-winded bylaws. It lived in the barrel of a gun, in the grinding tone of voice, in the daring stare of men in black vests whose authority no one could quite define. Maya said nothing. She just stood there, back straight like a marker post, her eyes unblinking. That silence had weight, had its own force. It wasn't submission, it was contempt so deep it refused to respond. And that was exactly what drove them mad. I saw the man's hand tighten around the gun like all he needed was the slightest excuse to pull the trigger, as if that weapon was the last valve holding back the fragile thread of control splintering inside his head. But what they didn't know was this. The woman standing there in silence was not someone who would bow. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know that for Maya, threats were just background noise. It was dignity that was non-negotiable. I stepped forward, feeling my entire body stretch to its limit. I didn't yell anymore. I pressed my voice low, firm, and sharp. If you think this is how to preserve a community, then this community is rotting from the inside. I wasn't saying it for them. I was saying it for everyone hiding behind curtains, behind double-glazed silence. A heavy, choking pause settled over us. But within seconds, the other man stepped forward, cutting in with a voice like a snake sliding over stone. Obedient residents live peacefully. Those who resist get removed. That's all there is to it. His words echoed like a sign at the entrance to a detention camp. Order is the top priority. A raw truth everyone knew, but few dared to speak aloud. Maya exhaled, a long, heavy breath, but not of fear. I knew it was how she kept herself from snapping too early. Inside Maya, calm had always been her first weapon, like a blade kept sharp in its sheath, like lightning before the thunder. I looked into her eyes and understood. Today was no place for compromise. If we backed down, Oak Ridge would keep backing down. If we stayed silent, silence would become the norm for everyone. She knew it. I knew it. I glanced around. The windows stayed barely open. Shadows moved quietly behind them. That silence, that refusal to act, was exactly what allowed the HOA's declarations to become reality. But not today. Finally, Maya spoke. Her voice was slow, steady, without a hint of fear. The law you speak of is just an excuse to mask the cowardice of those hiding behind the name of community, and that excuse is about to be exposed. Each word fell like the release pin of a grenade, stopping the man with the gun in his tracks for half a second. In that brief silence, the other man made a move to step forward, but Maya's voice continued firm as a verdict. You do not have the authority to decide who belongs in Oak. You never have. The air thickened, charged like it was heavy with electricity. I felt every cell in my body stretch tight, every heart heartbeat like a hammer. And I knew, Maya's words weren't just for those two men. They were for the entire neighborhood, for everyone watching and silent. Once spoken, they could not be taken back. They were the first crack, the warning bell, the declaration of war against a false order that had ruled this place for far too long. I took a deep breath and stood right beside Maya. From this moment on, everything had changed. The residents of Oak Ridge, whether they wanted to or not, had heard, and they could no longer pretend they hadn't. That morning, Oak Ridge did not wake to birdsong or a soft breeze. It woke to the truth, to a gun that never fired, yet still shattered the illusion so many had believed in. Maya stood tall, frame sharp, and composed like a blade being honed by the very storm in front of her. Her eyes were as cutting as a knife, slicing through the camouflage of the man holding the gun, and her voice rang out, calm and strangely steady. "You are overstepping, and you will pay for it." No need to shout, no need to snarl. Her words carried their own quiet gravity, like the final bell before the gavel drop, like a warning echoing over the edge of a collapsing cliff. The man across from her paused not long enough to call it panic, but just enough for me to catch the flicker of something unmistakably human in his eyes. He just didn't dare call it fear. He leaned down and spat hard onto the pavement. Filthy, deliberate, shameless. Blackish droplets splattered just in front of Maya's shoes. A coward's attack held back only by his failure to pull the trigger. Then he tilted his head, voice dropping low and catching in his throat, laced with pure contempt. "Who do you think you are?" In the slanted sunlight of late morning, his face twisted, wrinkled with rage, with humiliation, with a warped pride, publicly challenged. His bloodshot eyes locked onto Maya like they meant to crush her, the stare of someone who had grown used to seeing fear. Every word he spoke wasn't just an insult, it was a final push to corner her, to extinguish that defiant gaze with a pile of hollow power dressed in the name of community security. I clenched my fist, the knuckles going pale with tension. The restraint in my chest felt like a stone pressed down, ready to split apart. I couldn't watch anymore. One step, then two. I moved forward and stood directly in front of Maya. My stance wasn't large, wasn't threatening, but my eyes didn't back down. I stared straight into the barrel like I was the one asking the question. "Do you dare?" Cold crept down my spine, but my voice came out hard as steel. "Put the gun down." Each word hit the pavement like a hammer, heavy, final. I wanted him to understand. Not every Oak Ridge resident would stay silent. Not everyone would bow when faced with his gun. He roared, his voice like a cornered animal, foul breath hitting my Either shut up, or both of you go down. The threat wasn't anything new. I'd heard it before in news stories, in neighborhood, where psychological terror wore the mask of order. But what was terrifying wasn't the words themselves. It was the fact that he no longer knew how to hold his mask in place. His hand holding the gun trembled slightly, not from wind, but from the unraveling of control, cracking through the hard shell he had. Maya's steady presence had pushed him back, not with feet, but in his mind. Maya placed her hand on my shoulder, light as a breeze, heavy with meaning. She remained calm, her eyes unchanged, so composed it was unsettling. She tilted her head slightly, lips tightening into a faint smile, not mocking, but something sharper, a silent message. "I see through you." And that was what unsettled them most. For those who abuse power, fear is the ultimate weapon. But when the person in front of them no longer fears, their power becomes nothing more than wet paper in the middle of a storm. The entire Oak Ridge street seemed frozen in time. The wind stopped. Leaves trembled softly. The silence was so deep you could hear your own heart. From the windows lining both sides of the road, I saw curtains shift, a few silhouettes watching quietly, but not a single person stepped outside. They stood behind glass like spectators of a nameless play, and the irony was, they themselves were the silent characters helping script the bitter end. That silence, the very thing that had allowed these HOA police to fester like a rot within the community, stretched on. But I knew that if Maya and I backed down today, that silence would be validated, allowed to continue as an unwritten rule blanketing the neighborhood, and no one else would ever stand up again. Maya drew a deep breath, not to steady herself, but to launch the final blow. She looked straight at the man holding the gun, her eyes locked, steady, as if every word she was about to say had been forged through years of facing injustice. "You dare invoke the law, but all you represent is your own cowardice, and it is that cowardice that will be your downfall." Her voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the thick air like a blade flesh. The man flinched, the gun in his hand trembled clear and undeniable. His partner snorted behind him, as if to speak, but didn't take a single step forward. I kept my gaze fixed on the one aiming the gun, not letting him see even a flicker of fear. I understood then. Abuse of power only thrives when fear protects it. But once that cord is cut, all self-made authority crumbles. I tightened my grip on Maya's hand, a vow in silence. "I am here, and I will not step back." A sudden gust of wind swept through. Leaves rustled high above, creating a sound like nature itself whispering toward justice. In that moment, I could feel the invisible line that the gunman had drawn between us, between citizenship and submission. But Maya, with one sentence, had used reason to slice through that line. And once it was gone, they had no retreat. They would either back down, or they would pull the trigger, and I knew they didn't have the courage for the second. The air stayed thick, Sweat dripped down my forehead, each heartbeat like a drumbeat, but only one thought echoed in my mind. Today, who truly holds power in Oak? Is it the self-appointed men with guns, or those who stand upright for their dignity? I knew the answer was already taking shape, clear and irreversible. The man facing Maya pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from the holster at his side, the cold metal catching the early sunlight with a silver flash. The reflected light swept across the pavement, shattering the fragile calm of the morning. He stepped forward, slow but deliberate, each stride soaked in the arrogant confidence of someone used to bullying and manipulating the vulnerable residents of this neighborhood. His grin stretched across a face twisted by contempt, as if he truly believed that within seconds, the woman standing before him would have her hands locked behind her back under the guise of official procedure. But what he didn't know, or more precisely, what had never crossed his mind, was that the very moment he reached out, drunk on his illusion of power, was the moment he had signed his own sentence. It all happened in less than a breath. Maya shifted just slightly, like a breeze skimming over still water. The move was precise, clean, almost too fast to see. A sharp crack rang out, cold and crisp, sending a chill straight down my spine like ice water. I caught a glimpse of the man's shoulder, twisted and locked in a perfect joint hold, his hand wrenched behind his back, completely immobilized. The gun dropped from his grip, clattering with a piercing clang onto the sidewalk, striking the edge of the concrete and sparking slightly before spinning across the asphalt. The sound of metal hitting pavement echoed like a death knell for the illusion of authority they had always believed was untouchable. The other man froze in place. His face went pale, his hands trembled like he'd been shocked. The gun in his grasp now looked like something foreign, heavy, no longer a symbol of strength, but a burden he didn't know how to carry. He took a step back, his voice cracking in panic. "What the hell is she?" The words fell from his mouth without passing through thought, as if fear had seized full control of him. He was no longer a self-styled HOA cop, he was now just a man watching his entire worldview snap in seconds. I stepped forward, taking in a deep breath. The air felt heavy on my chest, but the words left me light and steady, loud enough for both to hear. "You just messed with the wrong person." I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to threaten, I just stated the truth, and that truth cut sharper than anything else. I watched the second man glance at Maya, then down at the useless gun on the ground, as if he finally understood that the show they had staged was over. Maya still held the man's arm in place, her body like a carved stone, solid and unshakable. The man groaned in pain, sweat beading on his forehead, his cry choked and desperate like a small animal caught in a trap. There was no trace left of the man who had once barked orders. As I looked at that scene, one thing became painfully clear. Their aggression had never been rooted in real strength. It had survived only through the fear this community had unknowingly allowed to grow. And now, in the sound of the dropped gun and the snapped shoulder joint, that fear had finally been crushed. The man locked in Maya's hold struggled, but she tightened her grip, not letting him break free. She didn't need to use excessive force, just enough for him to understand that everything had now slipped out of his control. The other man raised his gun by reflex, but his hands were trembling uncontrollably, his eyes darting in panic with no direction. Maya tilted her head slightly, her gaze brushing past me like a signal. She wasn't afraid and she wasn't backing down. I stared directly at the one holding the gun, stepped forward slowly, my eyes fixed on him with a coldness sharp enough to make his shoulders flint. "Go ahead," I said quietly. "Pull that trigger, and you'll find there's no way out." The air felt compressed. No one spoke. The only sound left was the painful groan of the man whose shoulder was locked, a rasping, dragging noise that grew harsher with every movement he made. The morning no longer felt like morning. It had turned into a silent battle. The houses around us remained still, but I knew without a doubt, behind every curtain, behind the glass windows, eyes were watching this unfold. They wouldn't forget this morning. Couldn't. They would remember the sound of the gun hitting the ground, the crack of bone, and the image of Maya, the woman who stood upright and unblinking, turning the tide of a power play the HOA police once thought untouchable. Maya applied just a little more pressure, and the man's cry tore through the thick silence. Then she leaned in, speaking each word with clarity. "That's enough. You crossed the line, and this is the consequence." Her words didn't threaten, they concluded. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but something cold threaded through it, as if her composure alone was more terrifying than anything she could say. I looked at the man and saw it in his eyes, emptiness. No more resistance, no more reaction, just the weight of reality hitting him like a blow to the back of the neck. The second man still stood frozen, the gun in his hand, nearly slipping from his grip. Sweat streamed down his temples, his breathing rapid, and his eyes lost their sharpness, acting like a child trapped inside a nightmare with no way out. He no longer believed in what he once believed in power, in the made-up laws they used to control the resident. The gun lying on the sidewalk, cold and useless, had become the bare symbol of the collapse of a power game built on fear. I knew, in that very moment, everything in Oak Ridge began to shift, because real power doesn't live in the barrel of a gun, or in a vest, or behind a badge labeled internal security. It lives in truth. It lives in people like Maya, those who know their worth, and aren't afraid to rise and defend it. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. Maybe there will be a meeting, maybe voices of criticism, but I know one thing for certain. From this morning forward, no one in this neighborhood will ever look at the HOA police fear again. And from that, Oak Ridge changed not because of the sound of a gun, but because one person dared to do what was right in the heart of what was wrong. The air hung heavy like a block of lead suspended above us, as if a single sharp breath could bring it crashing down and crush everything beneath. No one moved, the trees stood still, and the early sunlight seemed frozen between the tension. My breathing felt labored, each inhale dragging a dull ache through my chest. On the sidewalk, the gun that had just fallen lay exposed, its metallic sheen blurred in the angled sunlight, glinting like a wound slashed across the artificial peace of the neighborhood. The man trapped in Maya's hold groaning in pain, his face twisted by panic and shame, as if all the arrogance once piled on his shoulders had been ground into dust, no fragment large enough to patch together the mask of authority he once wore with ease. The other man still held his weapon, but his hands were visibly shaking. The grip slid within his sweat-soaked palm. The barrel pointed at us more out of instinct than intention. His eyes had lost focus. I saw his finger resting on the trigger, a small detail that made every muscle in my body tighten, but it stayed frozen, too afraid to move. Not out of hesitation, but because fear had swelled into a rising wave, choking off whatever willpower he had left. The veins in his arm stood out in bruised line, as if even his body was resisting whatever came next. Maya glanced his way. Her look was as cold as steel forged in fire, sharp as a bullet yet to be fired. "Drop the gun, unless you want to lose a finger." The words came from lips that didn't tremble, without flair or volume. It wasn't a threat, it was a command, and that command came from someone who was more than a citizen. She was a soldier. Someone who had once felt the pull of a trigger, who knew just how short the distance was between instinct and reason in a life or death moment. Now, standing in the middle of a deceptively quiet street, Maya carried the weight of that entire history in her voice, making it impossible to ignore. I saw the man's body stiffen. He didn't freeze because he obeyed, froze because he couldn't go on. Maya's words didn't just threaten injury, they peeled back the most primal fear inside anyone who abuses power. Fear that the other side no longer fears them. Then, slowly, the gun slipped from his hand. The dry clank of metal hitting pavement landed like a slap to his belief in his own power. He turned and ran, his footsteps slamming against the asphalt like the erratic heartbeat of someone exposed. No explanation, no retreat with dignity, just a coward's escape, like an animal realizing its teeth had been ripped out. The entire neighborhood fell silent. No cars, no conversation, not even the wind through the trees carried sound. The air felt buried under a layer of gray ash, the residue of truth freshly unearthed, raw and unfiltered. The self-claimed law of Oak Ridge, the shadows people once turned away from in discomfort, now stood exposed. No more shine, no more power, only the stench of sweat and the bitter sting of humiliation still clinging to the air. I looked up and saw a few figures behind the window. One person had a hand over their mouth, eyes wide in disbelief, as if they couldn't accept what they had just witnessed. Another stepped deeper into the shadow, gaze evasive, still not ready to face the reality. I knew them, knew every one of them. Residents who had once paid fines in silence because their grass grew more than 10 centimeters, or because their trash bins were out 2 hours too early. They had heard threats, endured discrimination, but no one had ever stood up until Maya shattered that invisible chain. Maya released the dislocated arm of the man she had pinned. He collapsed like an empty sack of cement, his body crumpling on the pavement, groaning weak. Maya stepped back, her eyes scanning the scene, the houses, the half-closed curtain, the hidden stairs. No grand gesture, no rallying cry, but the entire street understood. The performance of power was over. It ended in disgrace, not with siren, but with a look and a single sentence. I stood beside Maya, chest rising and falling, my heart pounded, unsure if it was leftover adrenaline or the quiet surge of emotion climbing its way up. I didn't know whether to feel proud or afraid, because I understood that what had just happened couldn't be taken back. Threats, the discrimination, the arrogance of the HOA, once whispers in the dark, had taken shape, and now, Oak Ridge had seen their true face, plain as daylight. None of the residents could pretend anymore that the HOA was just a boring management body. They had seen it. Real gun, real threat, and unhidden prejudice. But in that same moment, they had also witnessed, for the first time, the one in power broken. Maya didn't strike, didn't shout, didn't need an ally. And yet, she made the entire system tremble with nothing but her fearless presence. Maya turned to me, faint smile on her lip. Not a victorious smile. It was the smile of someone who knew she had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She said nothing, but I could hear the message loud and clear in her eyes. They thought fear could keep everything under control, but it's that very fear that turned and bit them back. And this was only the beginning. I looked down at the gun on the ground, cold, useless, an undeniable piece of evidence. Then I raised my head and looked around. The houses still closed, people still peeking out from behind curtains. But a question echoed inside me, one I couldn't shake. How much longer until the residents of Oak Ridge dare to step out of the silence? How much longer until they realize the shadow they've been fearing is nothing but a hollow shell, cracking more and more each day? The metallic scent of the gun mixed with sweat, dust, and tension, all of it slowly dissolving into the wind. I took a deep breath. I knew he would be back. Barbara Steele, the one behind the HOA police, would not let this slide. But Oak would crack. crack, a real fracture, and through that fracture, truth would seep in, tearing apart the fake shell they once called stability. The moment the gun hit the ground, everything seemed to stop. I knew that was the line between a fearful Oak Ridge and an Oak Ridge beginning to wake up. And it was Maya, with her ice-cold composure and blade-sharp precision, who lit the spark for that awakening. I looked at my wife, filled with a feeling I couldn't name. Part of it was anger for how long we had lived in silence. Part of it was pride because Maya wasn't just the woman who jogged in the morning. She was the beginning, the symbol, the price abusers of power would pay for underestimating human dignity. That morning, Oak Ridge was no longer peaceful, but for the first time in years, it truly breathed. And that breath, with steel and confrontation, carried the taste of freedom. A resident living at the corner, someone I knew, often stood on his balcony, watching everything that happened in the neighborhood, had raised his phone the moment the cart bearing the HSD logo rolled in. He wasn't the type to speak much at community meeting, but something in his instincts must have told him that morning would be different. When Maya had a gun pressed to her head, when I faced the other barrel, that phone stayed up, recording everything from the first, second to the last. By noon, the video had appeared on a community forum, captioned with a line that read like an accusation. HOA police pulled a gun on black woman jogger. I saw the headline flash across the screen and couldn't believe it. What had happened just a few hours ago was now exposed to thousands of eyes. The title didn't exaggerate, didn't embellish it, reflected exactly what happened. A black woman had a gun aimed at her head, in a neighborhood long marketed as one of the best places to live. The comments under the video flooded in like a torrent. Who gave the HOA the right to carry guns? Was the question repeated again and again, echoing like a gavel striking down. Some people shouted in outrage, demanding to know how a residential management group could build a fake armed force. One wrote, "This is a crime, not community management." The words kept coming, each one a spark, together becoming a firestorm spreading fast across social media. Maya read the comments one by one, her face not showing much expression, but I knew something inside her was burning. She had grown used to Oak Ridge's complicit silence, but online, strangers who had never lived here recognized the injustice immediately. They didn't need context. They didn't care about the HOA letters. They only had to see a black woman being threatened at gunpoint, and it was enough to make them furious. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled. The officials rushed to file takedown requests, reported copyright violation, and pleaded with the platform to protect the community's reputation. But the more they tried to erase it, the more the video spread. Users downloaded it, re-uploaded it across dozens of channels, turned it into short clips, commented, analyzed, and mocked. A few digital news outlets started paying attention, realizing this wasn't just a minor incident. It was evidence of unchecked authority by an HOA that believed it stood above the law. That afternoon, I got a message from a journalist friend. "This video's gaining fast. If what's in the clip is accurate, HOA Oak Ridge won't be able to hide this." I read the message and felt two opposing currents rise in me. Part of me felt relieved that the truth was finally in the open. Part of me felt uneasy, because I knew that when those in power start to lose their grip, they don't go quietly. Just as expected, the HOA released an internal statement, calling it a misrepresented incident captured without context. They deliberately tried to deflect, labeling Maya as an aggressive individual, then claimed the clip showed only part of the story. But viewers didn't need more context. They had seen a gun pointed at a woman's head, and that was enough. The HOA's excuses only poured fuel on the fire. Outrage in the comments doubled. People made memes the moment the man snarled at Maya, and added bitter captions like, "HOA law equals jungle law." In just a few short days, the video had spread far beyond Oak Ridge. It showed up in large community groups, and some even made reaction videos, pausing at the frame where Maya had a gun to her head to comment on how absurd it was. I scrolled through thousands of critical remarks, lines like, "This is America in 2025, not feudal time," flashing across the screen. I knew what was happening couldn't be undone. Once the online community had hold of a story, it would keep living, no matter how hard the HOA tried to bury it. Barbara Steele, the head of the HOA, began appearing more frequently, showing up at meetings with a tense face. I heard she slammed her desk in anger when she learned the video had gone public. Barbara had long ruled through fear and fine, but those weapons no longer worked. Online, she became a figure of ridicule, a dictator in business attire, hiding behind the title of community protection to seize control. As night fell, I sat in the living room, watching the neighbors' porch lights flicker outside. My phone kept buzzing with notifications, strangers sending messages of support, sharing stories, asking questions, recounting similar experiences with their own HOAs. I realized Maya's story was no longer just hers. It had touched a nerve buried deep in millions of residents. People who had been unfairly fined, micromanaged, or made to feel their dignity meant nothing, now saw a place to anchor their voices. Maya sat next to me, her gaze distant but steady. She spoke softly. "You see, what they thought was power is now a weight crashing down on them." I nodded. She was right. Truth, once exposed, never returns to the dark. And once public outrage is ignited, there's no stopping how far it will spread. All of Oak Ridge seemed to be holding its breath. The residents were silent, but they looked at each other with different eyes. They had seen the clip, read the comment, watched the world turn its gaze on the place they once believed was a paradise. No one dared dared speak publicly in defense of the HOA, because everyone understood siding with the HOA now was like tying yourself to a burning pyre. Every time I opened my phone, I saw the video pop up somewhere new. Climbed into the trending section of a video platform. It aired on an evening news segment, and it was even turned into satirical meme. The line, "In Oak Ridge, we are the law," became a punchline, repeated thousands of times alongside mocking images. Those who once believed themselves to be untouchable now stood exposed as clowns before the entire world. I knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of the storm that was about to hit, but I also knew that the wave couldn't be stopped. It had moved beyond Barbara and her enforcer's control. Oak Ridge would never go back to what it was, and inside me, despite the unease, there was a quiet sense of relief because justice had finally found its voice. That fateful video had become a mark. It captured not just a moment of confrontation, but the raw truth of a community suffocated by manufactured authority. Now, everything had changed, and no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. Right after the clip began to spread, the atmosphere in Oak Ridge shifted dramatically, as if someone had flipped a switch in a dormant nervous. The street, once pristine and quiet, where footsteps were usually the loudest sound, now buzzed with conversations people had previously been too afraid to voice. Families who once bowed their heads in silence began to whisper to one another when they crossed paths in backyards, by fences, during early morning jog. Old stories once folded away and hidden like bruises beneath clothing started to surface. Every small detail, every time someone was scolded by the HOA, every condescending glance, every absurd fine, all of it accumulated like mold pulled into the open by sunlight. And then, the long-suppressed outrage began to spread, without structure, without coordination, driven only by truth, and that truth ignited like sparks falling on dry straw. People no longer wanted to hide. One evening, while I stood on my porch with a glass of cold water untouched in my hand, a man approached. He wore a faded jacket with an old military patch nearly worn away, his boots as heavy as his step. I recognized him as the veteran who lived at the end of the block, quiet black man who usually stood alone under his awning each afternoon. His face was lined deep with age and war. His clouded eyes lit strangely as he spoke. "They once pulled a gun on me, just for hanging a flag on my porch." Froze. There was no anger in his voice, no fear either. Only a dry kind of shame, not the shame of weakness, but the shame of betrayal. Flag he once bled for, the flag buried with his fellow soldiers, had become the very excuse the HOA used to threaten and humiliate him, right on the land he called home. I didn't know what to say in response. I only knew that his story hit me like another slap to the false face of those who claimed to stand for order. And then it wasn't just him. Others began to speak out, too. A Latina woman I'd once met at a community meeting shared that her son had been barred from using the neighborhood pool for being too noisy, while the children of HOA board members played loudly without a word. An Asian family said they were fined for planting flowers in front of their home, supposedly because they clashed with the landscape, even though the two neighboring houses had the same flowers and received no warning. Each story was like a needle to the skin, not painful for its size, but because of how many there were. The outrage was no longer isolated. It had become a rising wave, sweeping through the streets and behind every window. The air in Oak Ridge thickened not with the eerie stillness of fear, but with the silence of a storm gathering strength just before it broke. Not long after, the local press began to show up. A group of reporters stood at the entrance to the neighborhood, holding microphones, carrying cameras, sweeping their lenses across every corner, every resident willing to speak the truth. They weren't just there to report, they sensed something bigger than a case of abuse of power. They understood that this wasn't just about a woman having a gun pointed at her. It was about an entire community silenced by a form of power as thin as paper, but as dangerous as a razor blade. The very next day, the first headlines hit the front page. The title ran bold and decisive. "Oh, Oak Ridge, under fire. Residents speak the truth that was hidden." Every word struck like a blade at the wall of authority built on residents' money, but sustained by fear. Barbara Steele, the head of the HOA, and her circle began to respond. They held a press conference. They sat beside lawyers, reading scripted lines from printed pages, struggling to keep their voices calm. "We regret the incident. The footage was edited. We are being misunderstood. The matter will be thoroughly investigated." But no one wanted to hear it anymore. The crowd didn't shout. They simply stood up and walked away. In the comment sections online, hundreds left messages, shared their own story. They no longer feared being reprimanded, no longer worried about retaliation. Some residents even printed photos of Maya facing down the man with the gun and taped them to their front windows like a declaration. "I will not stay silent." They thought a few speeches and a meeting would be enough to put out the fire, but they didn't realize the fire had already become an ocean. Every story told, every truth spoken aloud, was a wave. And when hundreds of waves collided, they didn't just shake a system, they swept away the foundation it stood on. Fear. Oak Ridge was no longer a place where residents looked down when passing the HOA police. Now, they looked them in the eye. They began to gather. They drafted petitions, demanded independent investigation, and called for the removal of the entire board. They were no longer timid, no longer scattered. They stood together. And that unity was the one thing the HOA had never prepared for. I watched it all unfold, with a mix of disbelief and pride. The people who used to sit in the back of meetings now hold microphones. The ones who were once threatened now stood in the open, telling their story. It all started with a single video, just a few minutes, but it tore a hole through the night woven by silence. And now, the light from that tear had spread too far to be sewn shut. I knew the fight would be long. I knew there would be retaliation, rumors, and resistance. But from this point on, no one could say, that didn't happen here. No one could deny what had been recorded, what had been heard, what had been felt deep in their own chest. And more important than all of that, the residents of Oak Ridge had seen one another. Not through avoidance, through recognition. They had realized that none of them was alone, and that, more than anything, is the foundation of real change. That morning, the Oak Ridge Community Hall was packed to capacity. Not a single empty seat from the front row to the back. People stood, leaned against walls, crowded the aisles. Everyone was there. No one wanted to miss the emergency meeting hastily called after days of chaos, where the HOA board was expected to provide a clear explanation to the community. But no one was waiting for answers anymore. They came to witness, to confront, to look into the eyes of those who had manipulated them for so long. The air inside the hall was taut, like a string wound, too tight. Any sound felt like it could set off an explosion. On the main stage, Barbara Steele sat at the center of a long table draped in white cloth, her face carefully made up, foundation thick like a coat of paint beginning to crack. But I could clearly see the deeper lines around her eye, where confidence once resided, now replaced by a guarded tension. Beside her sat the usual HOA board members, those familiar faces who used to nod silently at every decision, now wearing stiff, solemn expressions, as if walking into a courtroom. When the microphone lit up and the spotlight hit the HOA logo behind them, Barbara began to speak. She tried to maintain her trademark composure, but everyone heard the tremor in her voice. The community deserves the truth. What happened wasn't what people saw online. Our security personnel were attacked by an aggressive individual. That is the truth. The accusation dropped like a slap. The hall swayed with the reaction, whispers bursting from all directions, chaotic noise of outrage, disbelief, and scorn. Someone grimaced and looked away. Someone else let out a bitter laugh. I sat there, blood rushing to my temple, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear through my chest. Blatant lie was the final nail in the coffin of my patience. I could not allow Maya to be slandered in the very place justice was supposed to speak. I shot to my feet, the metal chair screeching against the tiled floor as every eye turned toward me. Without hesitation, I raised my phone, already synced to the projector, and my voice struck like a hammer. Watch this. The light hit the white wall behind the board table. A silence blanketed the room as if everyone had stopped breathing. The video appeared. Every frame, every second, sharp and undeniable. Maya, in her light athletic gear, was jogging slowly along the sidewalk. Two men in black vests jumped out of a cart, blocking her path. A gleaming gun pressed directly against her temple. Their voices rang out, raw, arrogant, defying the very notion of law. In Oak Ridge, we are the law. Then came the scoffing laugh, Maya's defiant response, the unmistakable crack of a joint, snapping back a retaliation no one could deny. Finally, the sound of the gun hitting the pavement, dry and cold. Those images needed no commentary. They spoke for themselves. When the video ended, the room erupted. Shouts burst like thunder. ND, no one can contain themselves any longer. Disband the HOA police. We don't need thug. Justice for Maya. The cries began scattered, quickly fused into a wave. Fists slammed into table. People jumped to their feet. Chairs toppled. Microphones screeched every sound, crashing together into a chaotic chorus of fury. No restraint was left. I looked around at faces that had once sat quietly, heads bowed in previous meetings, now burning with fire. The eyes that used to avert now stared straight at the stage, unflinching. Barbara Steele sat frozen. The careful makeup couldn't mask the paper-white face beneath it. Her lips moved, trying to speak, but no sound made it past her throat. She reached for the microphone, but no one was listening. The hall had become a storm, sweeping away every excuse, every carefully rehearsed justification. The people beside her, once eager to nod at every word, once seated proudly at award ceremony, now shrank back, eyes downcast, looking for somewhere to hide. Not one person rose to defend her. I stood there, heart still pounding like war drum. Pride surged inside me, unlike anything I'd felt before. For the first time in years, the residents of Oak Ridge were no longer swayed by empty promises, no longer lulled by pretty speeches about stability and order. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, heard the arrogant confession from the man with the gun, and now they refused to remain silent. The truth had been exposed, and truth, once revealed, can never be locked back in the dark. Every chant echoed like a hammer strike against the walls of fake authority. Every glare of anger targeted the board. Barbara Steele had no footing left, no way out. For the first time, the woman who had controlled this entire community with a sweet, poisonous voice had been cornered. Her eyes darted, searching for allies, searching for a way out, but no hand reached for her. Because this time, the crowd was not following. This time, they were leading. The HOA meeting, once a place for dull debates about fence colors or trash pickup hours, had transformed into a public tribunal. An uprising, a trial without a jury, but armed with truth and the voice of a community. The pounding fist, the applause, the unified chants became a declaration more powerful than any resolution ever passed. And I knew, flame lit by that video, by Maya's pain, by silence finally broken, would not be easily extinguished. Oak Ridge had changed. No longer a quiet, obedient neighborhood. No longer a place where power lay in the hands of those wearing black vests, hiding behind a false banner of righteousness. From that day on, it became a place where truth stood in full view, where residents were no longer spectators but protagonists. And right there, under those lights, in that very hall, an old era came to an end. Do you believe an HOA should have the right to establish an armed force? What's your opinion? The news exploded faster than anyone in Oak Ridge could have imagined. It was no longer just an internal matter, no longer a dispute between residents and the board. Overnight, it turned into a media bombshell. The next morning, as I turned on the television, the CNN logo appeared alongside a bright red banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen. HOA police pulled a gun on black woman jogger. A reporter sat in the studio with a grim expression. No need for lengthy introductions. The video that followed spoke for itself. Maya jogging, two men intercepting her, one pressing a gun to her temple, then being disarmed in a matter of seconds, played over and over, each time landing like a punch to the viewer's gut. No explanation was needed. The footage was shocking enough. Moments later, Fox News aired a special segment, with commentators divided into two camps, arguing fiercely on live television. One side called it blatant abuse of power, with HOAs morphing into oppressive forces under the guise of security. The other, while attempting to justify it, couldn't conceal their unease about the idea of armed neighborhood security. The Associated Press quickly released a comprehensive report, not only recounting the incident, digging into Oak Ridge's history, and, most notably, the controversial record of Barbara Steele, the woman dubbed the Iron Lady of the HOA. In less than 24 hours, the name Oak Ridge, once just a quiet, secluded suburban neighborhood, had become a national flashpoint. The U.S. media map marked a glaring red dot right over it. Social media erupted. Clips were edited, shared, and commented on in a frenzy. The hashtag number, HOA, police state shot to the top of national trend. Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, all were flooded with videos and images. The arrogant phrase, "In Oak Ridge, we are the law," was turned into meme, protest slogans, and symbols of absurdity, shared thousands of times as if to tear apart a power once thought untouchable. Public outcry didn't stop at angry posts. In the storm of outrage, many military veterans spoke out. A former Marine appeared on MSNBC, voice taut with anger. "We fought to protect freedom, not to see a homeowners association point guns at people in their own neighborhood." A former F-16 pilot couldn't hide his frustration. "If we let this slide, every HOA in America will start building its own armed force. Who would want to live anywhere?" These weren't just opinions, they were alarm bells, tolling directly into the conscience of a nation, amplifying the outrage, deepening the impact, cutting across politics and race. Maya sat beside me, eyes locked on the screen. Her face remained calm, but I could see her hand clenched tight, knuckles drained of color. I knew she was wrestling with conflicting emotion, relief that the truth had been exposed, but also anxiety at how far beyond control things had gone. I stepped to the window and looked outside. Oak Ridge lay in silence, the sky unclouded, everything looking exactly as it always had, but I understood that that was just the surface. The storm had already arrived. Now, we weren't just confronting an arrogant HOA. We were at the center of national attention, the focus of a rising wave of anger across every media platform. The press kept coming. From early morning, broadcast vans lined up outside Oak Ridge's main gate, antennas stabbing skyward like steel needles. Reporters in tailored suits held microphones and scanned the scene for witnesses, and the residents, for the first time in their lives, found themselves being asked for their voices. No longer people living in the shadows of control, they had become voices worth hearing. One by one, they spoke. I was reprimanded for flying a flag. My son was kicked off the playground for speaking too loudly. They made my husband and me remove our flower pots because they disrupted the aesthetic. Each account was a drop of ink staining the pristine map that the HOA had tried so hard to preserve. And the more stories were told, clearer the picture became of a community ruled by fear, undeniable, and exposed in full. Barbara Steele appeared just once on the local news, dressed in a neutral gray suit, her hair pinned high. She looked directly into the camera and read from a carefully rehearsed script with the kind of composure that only training could produce. This story is being exaggerated. Everything was handled according to procedure. But viewers' eyes were no longer so easily misled. The video was too clear. No procedure could justify a gun to the head of an unarmed woman jogging in broad daylight. Barbara's poise only poured fuel on the fire. Soon after, the hashtag number Barbara Step Down began to trend, surged across Twitter, echoed on national broadcast, and quickly became a formal demand sent by Oak Ridge residents to the state authority. My phone started ringing nonstop, numbers I didn't recognize. Some were journalists requesting interview. Others were lawyers offering free legal support. A few were veterans not asking for anything, not speaking with sentimentality, only to say one thing: we stand with Maya. One gravelly male voice called at the end of the day, slow and deliberate. I served in Delta Force. Your wife did the right thing. She's the pride of many of us. I froze, phone still in hand, my throat. Maya said nothing, but when I looked over, her eyes glowed with a quiet pride, not flashy, but steady. The story of Oak Ridge was no longer just the story of one neighborhood. It had crossed the boundaries of fences and street signs. It had become a national test of whether the people would allow HOAs to overstep their bounds, create their own forces, and declare themselves the law, or whether they would rise, not just for Maya, but for the very idea of civil self-governance in America. From obscure forums to state legislature, the topic spread. A few politicians began referring to Oak Ridge as a cautionary. Some proposed absolute bans on HOA owning armed security force. Others called for the formation of a federal investigation committee. That night, I sat back in front of the screen, the room dimly lit, remote still in my hand, untouched. Final newscast of the day closed with a line from a Fox News anchor. Oak Ridge is no longer a neighborhood story. It's a mirror reflecting the terrifying truth of what happens when power goes unchecked. That sentence rang like a bell. It wasn't just about HOAs or Barbara Steele. It was everywhere, in every institution, every form of power left unregulated. I turned off the television. The room was lit only by the soft yellow glow of the floor lamp. Maya sat across from me, hands clasped, her gaze no longer fixed on the screen, pointed toward the window. Outside, night had fallen, but the whole world was watching. She spoke quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. They thought they could hide behind Oak Ridge's wall, but this time, there's no way back. I nodded. The storm had arrived. And from this point on, we weren't fighting alone anymore. I opened the mailbox at the front gate. Amid the usual junk flyers and monthly bills was a plain white envelope with no return address. The paper inside was neatly folded, but the handwriting was jagged, rushed, etched with hate. You'll regret this. The words stopped me cold. My fingers clenched the note until it crumpled in my hand. There was no longer any doubt the people inside the HOA had chosen how to strike back. When they couldn't control the narrative, they'd turned to direct intimidation. That night, as I sat on the porch, I noticed headlights sweeping across the street again and again. A dark-colored car was parked a short distance from my house, engine off, but I could clearly make out two silhouettes inside. They didn't move, didn't speak, but the silence they carried weighed heavier than any shouted threat. The same thing happened over the following night. Each time I turned off the lights to sleep, I'd hear the faint hum of an engine idling in the distance. Maya would step beside me at the window, calm and unmoved, eyes locked on the black car in the dark. Then she'd whisper, "Let them watch. They'll be the ones trembling in the end." I knew Maya meant it. She had never allowed threats to break her, but I also understood that for someone who had been through war, that calm was a shield for razor-sharp vigilance. I saw it in the way she checked every lock 3 times, the way her ears tuned to every small sound in the yard. It was the preparation of someone who didn't underestimate danger, but refused to let it dictate the rhythm of her life. I tried to act normal around our daughter, not letting her sense anything unusual. But at night, once everyone was asleep, I'd sit at the wooden table and reopen the letter with its shaky scrawl. I wondered whether the cowards lurking in the dark thought they had scared. In truth, all they did was expose their own weakness. A group that crowned itself with absolute power, yet had to hide behind scribbled threats and cars veiled in shadow. Maya stepped up behind me, laid her hand on my shoulder, and said firmly, "Don't let them see us flint. They're the ones unraveling now." I looked up at her, and saw in her eyes that same steely light I'd seen when she faced down the barrel of a gun. That look alone reminded me that even when the night closes in, we still hold the one weapon stronger than all others: the truth. The night over Oak Ridge hung heavier than before, but I knew the light hadn't gone. The cars watching us would vanish, and those words, "You'll regret," would become evidence of the downfall of those who called themselves the law. They sowed darkness, but it's that very darkness that will devour them first. I shut the window and sat back down in the living room, my chest still burning. But instead of fear, a fire of fury surged through me. I knew that every threat would only make the people of Oak Ridge more determined. We had endured too much for too long, and now, they would truly regret it. The news of the incident had spread so widely that the HOA board could no longer pretend to remain silent. 1 week later, they appeared alongside a team of lawyers, stepping in front of the camera's blank expression. Their legal representative, a slick man in a gray tailored suit, addressed the crowd of reporters. "We maintain that our security personnel acted within the bounds of justified self-defense. Resident Maya behaved aggressively, forcing them to draw their weapon." The statement was read like a prepared script, every word released slowly, smoothly, but with each syllable, fury inside me boiled hotter. I stood among the crowd, my chest tightening. The way the HOA twisted the truth was shameless, as if the entire community were blind and mute. They wanted to cast the one with the gun as the victim and turn Maya into the aggressor. I glanced at her arms folded, standing tall amid the sea of people, her eyes calm but cold. When the lawyer finished his excuses, she tilted her head toward me, her lips curling into a chilling smile, and whispered, "Let's see who regrets it." Her words echoed in my head like a vow. I knew Maya never spoke empty threats. That smile wasn't just mockery, it was a warning to those who dared to distort the truth. They thought hiding behind attorneys and legal jargon would protect, but Maya had faced enemies far more dangerous, in battlegrounds far more brutal. Compared to what she had endured, quivering HOA board was nothing more than a farce. Reporters raised their microphone, pressing the lawyer about the video, about the unmistakable image of a gun aimed at Maya's head. He dawdled, saying the footage was incomplete, that the full context wasn't clear, but the evasion didn't last. A young journalist pulled out a full version of the clip and asked, "This is the full context. What's your excuse now?" The crowd erupted behind her, voices rising in protest. I saw Barbara Steele's face stiffen, her makeup unable to mask fear breaking through. Maya said nothing, letting the truth speak for itself, but I knew she was already lining up her next move. She once told me, "They're used to surviving by spreading fear. When the fear is gone, they've got nothing left." I looked around and saw the residents of Oak Ridge standing closer together than ever before. They whispered, they nodded. They were beginning to believe that Maya wasn't alone, and neither were they. That night, as we sat in the living room, flickering light from the screen cast uneven shadows across the ceiling. The news replayed footage of the HOA lawyer making excuses, intercut with the voices of residents shouting back. Maya leaned into the chair, her eyes still glinting with resolve. She said, "Let them keep playing their word games the longer it drags on. Clearer they expose themselves. They want to paint black as white, but everyone can see the truth." I sat beside her, feeling the weight in my chest, but also a rising sense of determination. If the HOA wanted to turn this into a war of semantic, we would turn it into an open fight, one where the light lay bare every hidden corner. Maya's cold smile haunted me through the night. It wasn't the smirk of petty satisfaction, it was a promise made to herself. Once placed in this position, she would not back down. I remembered the moment the barrel was pressed to her head, the way she turned in a flash and transformed a brute into a screaming heap. She had never needed anyone to protect, but this truth was bigger than any counterstrike. It was an unmasking of an entire system of abuse, and I knew Maya would see it through to the end until they regretted everything. The darkness still hung over Oak, the unfamiliar cars still lingered like shadows, but the fear didn't cling to me the way it once had. I had Maya beside me, and the truth on our side. The faceless cowards outside could send threats, they could pay lawyers to lie, but they couldn't extinguish a community that had begun to awaken. Maya had sparked the flame, and now that fire was burning brighter than ever. After the chaotic meeting, a group of residents and I decided we couldn't sit and wait any longer. We gathered at the small house of Mr. Harris, a retired teacher who had been fined multiple times by the HOA for growing vegetables in his garden. On his old wooden table, we laid out every file we had collected from various sources. Loose pages, invoice, copies of internal documents, all stacked together like pieces of a dark puzzle. I opened my laptop and began combing through every detail, while the others took turns recounting what they knew. We quickly spotted the irregularity. In the official paperwork, HOA Police was listed merely as a community safety support team, with no government-issued permits whatsoever. That meant all patrols, inspections, and especially the carrying of weapons were entirely illegal. A chill ran down my spine as I flipped through more pages, uncovering weapons purchase receipts from questionable vendors. Few of the firearm serial numbers matched those previously flagged in black market reports. Mr. Harris leaned forward, his voice trembling with anger. "This is proof they armed themselves illegally. No one authorized them. They bought from the black market and threw on a security badge to intimidate the whole community." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of what we were discovering settling over everyone. What the HOA had called a security was nothing more than a group assembled by Barbara Steele and armed under the table to exert dominance. A woman sitting beside me broke into tears. She said her son had once been chased out of the playground by two men in black vests, and when he talked back, they pinned him to the ground at gunpoint as a warning. Her family had lived in fear, staying silent, believing the HOA had license and legitimate power. Now, with the truth exposed, anger eclipsed everything else. I heard furious whispers circle the table, people clenching their fists, eyes lighting up as if they had just discovered a weapon more powerful than gun. Evident. I carefully documented every piece, and with a few others, made copies as backup. The more I turned the pages, the more disgusted I became at how thoroughly the HOA had concealed the truth. Suspicious expenditures listed as landscape maintenance were actually gun purchase. Internal meetings were buried, with no minutes ever shared with residents. It was all part of a massive charade. Barbara and her enforcers, sitting above it all, dealing out fear to people who were supposed to live in peace. Sitting in that cramped room, I realized the full absurdity of what we had tolerated for so long. A residential community does not need an armed force, and it certainly cannot allow self-proclaimed leaders to threaten people at gunpoint. We had once stayed quiet out of fear of fine, of being labeled uncooperative. But now, proof in hand, fear gave way to resolve. Maya sat by the window, watching the others, then said softly, "We've exposed the farce. It's time to bring it into the light." Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned like fire. I knew she was right, because if this truth wasn't made public, Oak Ridge would remain forever in the dark. Everyone had bowed their heads to a force that didn't exist in any legal document, a force built on lies and black market gun. When the meeting ended, each person took a portion of the documents to keep safe. We agreed to contact the press and the authorities within the week. Outside, night had fallen, and Oak Ridge was as quiet as usual, but I could feel something had shifted. In that small house, flame of resistance had been lit, and once the truth had been exposed, there would be no way for the HOA to hide it again. I flipped through more of the papers, hastily printed sheet, none bearing official seal, just internal memos passed around. Just when I thought we had uncovered the most damning evidence, an email popped up on the screen that froze the entire room. The subject line was clear: increased surveillance of black residents. I read it over and over, my heart pounding like a fist against my chest. This was no longer speculation or vague suspicion of bias. This was an official direct, written, sent, and archived within the HOA's own system. No one spoke right away. Mr. Harris rested his hand on the table, his knuckles trembling, eyes reddening as he shook his head at me. Another woman broke down in tears, her muffled sobs thickening the already heavy air. For years, people had been harassed, unfairly fined, threatened everyone, quietly felt something was wrong, but no one had hard proof. And now, those words on the screen cut through every excuse like a blade. This wasn't hidden bias, it was policy. I printed a copy of the email, placed it in the center of the table, and looked each person in the eye. This is irrefutable evidence. It wasn't a mistake, it was planned, it was deliberate, and we were the target. My voice dropped, each word landing with weight. Maya sat beside me, her eyes flashing coldly, nodding once. She didn't need to say anything, the truth itself was enough to shatter the HOA's false image of community protection. We continued combing through the files, and the deeper we went, the more disturbing details we found. Vague budget entries marked as special enforcement costs, lists of monitored homes most belonging to black or immigrant families. Every line, every figure felt like a slap, not just to the residents of Oak Ridge, but to the fragile belief justice still had a place here. A middle-aged man, normally quiet and mild-mannered, suddenly slammed his hand on the table, his voice grinding through clenched teeth. "They've been playing this game for far too long. For years, we endured it, thinking the law was on their side. Now we know the truth. Abuse of power mixed with discrimination, that's a crime." The others all nodded in unison, faces burning with anger. I knew everything had changed. These were no longer scattered stories, no longer denied suspicion. We had black and white proof, evidence strong enough to bring down the entire Oak Ridge HOA system. That email would be the key, the sentence they had written against themselves. Everyone understood that, from here, fight wouldn't stop at protest, it was heading to court, to the place where justice is named and heard. In that small room, as the email printout passed from hand to hand, I felt it clearly. Fear had shattered. In its place stood resolve, a deep hunger to reclaim dignity. Oak Ridge stood at the edge of transformation, and this time, the HOA would not escape the weight of the very evidence they had left behind. That morning, Oak Ridge felt as if it had been jolted awake by the thunderous roar of engines. Convoys of black vehicles bearing federal emblems came to a halt right in front of the HOA office. The glass doors where Barbara Steele once emerged with her air of authority were now surrounded by dozens of agents. They wore bulletproof vests, carried stacks of warrant, and entered without warning. Residents poured outside, forming clusters of onlookers, their eyes wide with disbelief and satisfaction. They whispered to one another, no one expecting this day to arrive so soon, the day when those who once claimed to be the law were shackled by the law itself. I stood beside Maya on the corner, watching the building being sealed. Bright red evidence tape stretched across the entrance, erasing the false glow of a place that had long sown fear. Agents came and went, hauling out boxes of documents, computers, and hard drive. Each time a box emerged, a wave of murmurs followed. Everyone knew the evidence inside would be enough to expose the lie, enough to end the arrogance of Barbara Steele and her circle. Maya remained composed, but I saw her eyes following every movement, as if confirming the execution of a plan long in the making. I knew the source of that calm. Days earlier, Maya had quietly submitted a cache of encrypted files to the federal authority. From the documents gathered by residents, she had isolated the most damning pieces, encrypted them, and sent them through a secure channel. She had even included a detailed analysis, mapping out the illegal weapons network and drawing clear connections between the HOA and black market suppliers. When one of the agents stepped out holding a folder, flipping through a few pages before nodding to a colleague, my pulse quickened. I knew that was the result of what Maya had done. She wasn't just the woman who fought back that day, she was the one who ensured the truth would surface, who made it impossible for the HOA to deny or erase their crime. A crowd of residents swelled, their murmurs turning into gleeful whispers. "It's about time," a middle-aged woman said, her eyes shining. An elderly veteran beside me exhaled deeply, as if releasing a weight he had carried for years. They had lived too long in silence, under abuse of power, and now, with the law finally standing present, it all burst burst forth, in a joy that words could barely hold. Barbara Steele was let out in cuffs. Her commanding presence was gone. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, her posture strained as she tried to lift her chin, eyes darting away from the lenses trained on her. Cameras clicked, reporters shouted over one another with questions she wouldn't answer. She had nothing left to say. In that moment, I saw the entire gilded facade collapse. Maya tilted her head slightly, looked at me, and said in a low voice, "This is what justice looks like, not in word, but in action." I nodded, needing no further explanation. I knew she had played a part in bringing about this moment. The law didn't arrive by chance. It came because someone dared to bring the truth into the light. That day, the entire Oak Ridge neighborhood stood for a long time, watching convoy after convoy carry away boxes of documents and Barbara, handcuffed alongside her accomplices. The air went still for a moment, then erupted into applause. Hands that once trembled in fear now clapped boldly in the open, like a declaration that needed no word. I joined the sound, feeling something lift from my chest. The darkness had passed, and the light of justice had finally poured into Oak Ridge. As agents continued removing files and equipment from the office, the truth became so undeniable that no one in Oak Ridge could pretend otherwise. The so-called HOA security revealed itself to be nothing more than a well-organized gang, operating under the guise of legitimacy to intimidate the very people who funded them. The documents laid bare connections to black market suppliers, from weapons to shady financial transactions. There was even a marked list of residents, mostly families of color or immigrant background, who had been systematically targeted. I looked around and saw Oak Ridge residents gathered in small groups, their faces a mix of disbelief and rising fury. Those who had endured intimidation for years now realized the ones they feared had never been part of any legitimate authority. They were just criminals in a community protection costume. The anger turned into murmurs, then swelled into a wave of outrage that rippled through the crowd. A middle-aged man burst out, "We've been living under the rule of thugs all these years." His voice trembled, but it carried the relief of a truth finally revealed. Barbara Steele was led away, her once perfectly styled hair now disheveled by the wind. Fake smile, the commanding presence gone, her head bowed, wrists bound tight. It was an image many residents had waited far too long to see. Camera lenses zoomed in, flashes flickered relentlessly, capturing the precise moment when Oak Ridge's false symbol of authority fell. She stepped into the prisoner transport van, her frame hunched in heavy silence. Maya stood next to me, her eyes sharp and bright, exhaling slowly. She didn't say a word, but I understood the look in her eye. All the days of endurance, the countless times she had been humiliated, finally been exchanged for the sight of the oppressors in handcuffs. I felt her hand gently grip mine, not seeking comfort, but affirming that from this moment on, no fear would ever rule Oak Ridge again. As the FBI convoy pulled away from the main gate, carrying boxes of documents, and the very people who had once spread fear, the entire neighborhood erupted into applause. The sound echoed through the street, wave after wave, like a symphony of relief. The elderly, young children, and families who had quietly endured for so long stepped outside, their faces lit with newfound brightness, no longer hiding behind curtains, lowering their eyes when passing the HOA office. At that moment, Oak Ridge came alive, for the first time in years, breathing the air of freedom. I watched those hands clapping without pause, listened to the cheers rise and blend with the hum of engines fading into the distance, felt something indescribable well up inside me. It wasn't just the joy of seeing justice done, it was collective liberation. We had witnessed the oppressors fall in the very place where they once claimed to be the law. And from this day forward, Oak Ridge would never again be a place ruled by fear. The day of the hearing arrived, and the local courthouse was packed, not just with Oak Ridge residents but with reporters from across the country. The hearing was broadcast live, every move, every word captured on camera for the nation to see. Outside, crowds gathered, many holding signs demanding the disbandment of the HOA, police, others calling for Barbara Steele to be held fully accountable. The air was thick, charged with anticipation and tension, as if this was no longer a community hearing, but a symbolic reckoning for unchecked power everywhere. I sat in the waiting gallery, heart pounding as my name was called. I stood and stepped up to the witness stand. The spotlight from the cameras hit my face, and I could feel the weight of millions watching through their screen. The judge asked me to take the oath, then gestured for me to begin. I took a deep breath, my voice firm. He pointed a gun at my wife's head. The room erupted, some gasping aloud in outrage and disbelief. I let the words hang in the air for a few seconds before continuing to recount everything that had happened. I told them about that morning, how Maya was out jogging when they blocked her path, how they issued baseless orders, spat on her, hurled insult, and finally drew a gun, pressing it to her temple. I emphasized that Maya never attacked first, that everything began with brazen abuse of power. I looked directly at Barbara Steele, sitting in the defendant's row, her face frozen but her eyes shifted. I knew my words were cutting through the polished lies they had tried to construct. The courtroom screen played the now viral video. The footage was crystal clear, the man's voice growling, "In Oak Ridge, we are the law," echoing and igniting the room. Some residents broke into tears, and others shouted for justice. The judge had to bang the gavel repeatedly to restore order, but I saw it truth could no longer be denied. The evidence was all laid out, undeniable and damning. Maya then took the stand, her voice steady as steel. She delivered every detail without hesitation, ending with a line that brought the entire courtroom to its feet in applause. I've faced battlefields before, but I never thought that in my own homeland, I'd have to face a gun barrel from those claiming to protect the community. Her words thundered through the room, etched into every mind. I looked around and saw Oak Ridge residents sitting shoulder to shoulder, many holding hands, their eyes burning bright. This was no longer just our family's pain, it was a collective accusation. That hearing did more than expose the crimes of the HOA police. Flung open the gates for justice to enter Oak Ridge openly, transparently, before the eyes of an entire nation. Maya stood under the glare of the light, placing her hand on the Bible, and declared, "I'm a Delta Force officer. I know what discipline and authority mean." The words hit the silence like a drumbeat, powerful and undeniable. I glanced around and saw eyes widen, a mixture of surprise and deep respect. In that instant, Barbara Steele and her lawyer's lies shrank into something pathetically small. Maya continued, recounting in vivid detail the terrifying morning in Oak Ridge. She described how they blocked her path, pointed a gun at her head, and used security as a pretense to justify discrimination. Her voice didn't waver, each word was sharp, carrying the weight of someone forged in military discipline. As she spoke of men carrying illegal weapons, of how they spread fear to maintain control, the courtroom swelled with outrage. Barbara sat below, her face pale. She tried to hold her posture upright, but her hands trembled uncontrollably on her lap. Even the high-priced lawyers found themselves cornered, because in front of millions watching live, no one could refute the truth being laid bare by a living witness. When Maya repeated the arrogant line, "In Oak Ridge, we are the law," the entire courtroom gasped, the murmur of anger erupting like a crashing wave. A man sitting behind me shouted, his voice choked fury, "We've been lied to for too long." His cry merged with the chants rising from all sides. "Disband HOA police. Justice for Oak Ridge." The judge banged the gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the fury in the room had already broken free. The residents of Oak Ridge, once silent and submissive, were now speaking as one, right at the heart of the court. Maya stood firm, her eyes locked on Barbara, her face cold and unflinching, radiating a quiet contempt for someone who had crowned herself false power. She didn't need to shout or threaten through truth and her own unshakable identity. She shattered the facade that the HOA had built. In that moment, I knew the scales of justice had tipped. No one believed the hollow defenses of the HOA anymore. The chants echoed long after the hearing ended, still resonating as I stepped out of the courthouse. I heard neighbors talking, saw hands gripping tightly, eyes lit with something they had almost forgotten recognition of who they were. A normal morning in Oak Ridge had once turned into a nightmare, but now, in full view of the nation, the truth had finally come to light. And from that moment on, there was no turning back for Barbara Steele or the counterfeit HOA police. Amid the tense courtroom hearing, one of the men who had worn the black vest stood up and asked to speak. He was one of the two who had confronted Maya that day, his face gaunt, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. His voice trembled, then suddenly broke into sobs in front of hundreds of residents and news cameras. "Barbara forced us to do it. She said if we didn't follow orders, we'd lose our jobs, lose our homes." The words dropped into the room like a stone, silencing it for a few seconds before angry murmurs exploded all around. He continued, tears streaming down his face. "We didn't want to aim guns, but Barbara made us do it to intimidate people. She said residents of color were a threat, that they needed tighter control." Every word hit like a blade, cutting into the dignity of Oak. People rose from their seat, shouting Barbara's name, some cursing through clenched teeth. I saw Maya clench her fist, eyes blazing with fury, but she stayed silent to let the turncoat finish his confession. When the court's attorneys presented the financial records seized during the raid, everything became even clearer. Page after page revealed that Barbara had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from maintenance and management. She had disguised it, fake expenses, labeled as infrastructure repairs or landscaping maintenance. But the money had gone into private accounts, used to buy up homes from residents forced to sell at rock-bottom prices, then flipped for double the profit. The room erupted with outrage. Those who had been pressured into selling their homes broke down in tears, recounting how they had been threatened with fines and security inspection until they had no choice but to leave. Now, they saw the entire scheme for what it was, a calculated system orchestrated by Barbara. This wasn't just about a few guns. It was about a greedy machine that had turned Oak Ridge into the private empire of a dictator in community clothing industry. Barbara sat motionless, her face drained of color, lips pressed tight, while her hands trembled violently. Every excuse she had prepared crumbled beneath the testimony and the numbers. I saw residents leap to their feet, fists raised, voices unified in a cry for justice. People who had remained silent for years were now speaking in unison, exposing the woman who had poisoned their community from within. Maya turned to me, her voice low but resolute. "There's nothing left to hide now. Her mask is off, and even those who followed her are turning against her." I nodded, feeling the collective fury morphing into a powerful force of unity. That hearing was no longer a debate over right or wrong, it had become a public sentencing, declared unanimously by the very community. Barbara Steele and her HOA police charade had tried to dominate. The financial files were placed directly on the evidence table, each page laying bare an undeniable truth. The auditor read aloud irregular expenditure, money siphoned from community dues, and funneled straight into Barbara Steele's personal account. Photos of homes forcibly sold for pennies and transferred to her relatives flashed across the courtroom's large screen. The room fell quiet for a moment, not from confusion, but because the shamelessness was so glaring that no one could believe it had festered for years right in the middle of Oak Ridge. The man beside me clenched his fist, his voice breaking. "We've been turned into prey in this dirty game." An elderly woman burst into tears, saying she had once been threatened by the HOA, that if she didn't sell her house, they would fine her into exhaustion. Now, everything connected, each grim fragment forming a complete picture. Barbara wasn't managing a community. She was manipulating it, building an entire machine to exploit and oppress. Maya stared directly at Barbara, her gaze as sharp as a blade. She didn't need to say anything because the evidence had already spoken. Barbara sat frozen, face drained of all expression. With each document raised, the crowd murmured in fury, and the chorus of protest grew louder. Fear that had once shackled Oak Ridge residents was unraveling, replaced by a rising tide of outrage. A reporter standing in the back blurted out, "This is the biggest HOA scandal in the state." That sentence ignited the room, setting off a storm of noise. The crowd began chanting in unison, first scattered, then swelling in force. "Lock her up! Lock her up!" The roar surged like a wave, pounding so intensely the judge had to strike his gavel repeatedly to restore order. I stood in the middle of the crowd, feeling the shockwave ripple from the front row to the back door. No one wanted to hear hollow excuses anymore. No one believed the lie. Enough was enough. That chant wasn't only for Barbara, it was for the entire system that enabled her. It was the fury of years of silence, finally erupting into a collective verdict from the people. Maya leaned in and whispered to me, "They've awakened. There's no way out for her now." I nodded, looking around, seeing faces flushed with anger, eyes burning with clarity. Oak Ridge had broken free from its stranglehold, and in that moment, Barbara Steele had lost everything. The cry of, "Lock her up," thundered on, like a gavel hammering the door shut on Oak Ridge's darkest chapter. The hearing was no longer a legal formality, it had become the people's judgment, where justice didn't come from a judge's bench, but from the unified voice of hundreds who had endured far too much for far too long. On sentencing day, the courtroom was packed. The once cold wooden benches were now filled with Oak Ridge residents, reporters jostling for space, camera lenses constantly shifting. The judge sat upright, his face stern, in front of a thick stack of files brimming with evidence. Everyone waited for the final moment, when justice would be named. Barbara Steele was led in, her hands bound in steel cuffs, her gait heavy, far cry from the arrogance she once flaunted at HOA meetings. Her face had gone pale, lips tightly pressed, eyes fixed on the floor as if trying to escape the world. Outside, hundreds of residents lined up to watch via the live feed. Those who once bowed their heads in silence now held their breath, all longing to hear the verdict read aloud. When the judge finally spoke, the entire room fell silent. He read through every charge, every count proven by document, testimony, and video footage. From illegal weapons possession to corruption and systemic abuse of power, each was listed clearly. And then, the words everyone had been waiting for rang out, echoing off the courtroom wall. Barbara Steele is sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The courtroom erupted. Applause, cheers, and sobs broke out all at once. An elderly woman buried her face in her hand, crying and laughing in the same breath, overwhelmed by the feeling of release. A veteran stood, fist raised, tears streaming down his face. I sat there, chest heaving, eyes stinging, realizing that this moment was not just a sentence for Barbara, it was a declaration that justice, though delayed, was never extinguished. Maya placed her hand on my shoulder, her eyes alight. She didn't need to say a word. I knew the pride that filled her. She had stared down the barrel of a gun, had brought the truth into the light, and now justice had struck its gavel before our very eyes. Every fear, every shadow that had once cloaked Oak Ridge shattered in that instant. But it wasn't only Barbara Steele. The judge continued, announcing that the HOA police was to be disbanded immediately, declared an unlawful organization. That declaration ignited the crowd again, cheers booming through the courtroom. People clapped, embraced, and some sobbed, knowing that from now on, there would be no more black vests patrolling with impunity, no more guns pointed at residents for the color of their skin. I thought back to the nights when strange cars lurked outside our home, to the threat-filled letters, to the HOA meetings steeped in pressure. It was all over now. The ones who once wielded fear had lost their weapon. Barbara was convicted, and the HOA police were dismantled. Oak Ridge had officially broken free, and its people were no longer helpless prey. When the final gavel fell, the sound echoed through me like a bell marking a new beginning. The entire courtroom stood, a wave of voices rising. Justice has prevailed. I joined the roar, my throat tight, but my heart lighter than ever before. Maya turned to me, her smile radiant, her eyes fierce with resolve. I knew that from this day on, Oak Ridge had turned the page. The trial had ended, but its echoes would resonate for a long time. Justice wasn't just delivered in the form of a sentence, it was affirmed in the hearts of every resident. Oak Ridge was no longer a place governed by fear, but a place where ordinary people had witnessed and reclaimed their right to live. When the final gavel struck, the courtroom erupted. Those seated in the back rows shot to their feet, many unable to hold back their sob. Applause mixed with weeping, forming a sound that defied description, grief and relief, pain and release, as if years of bondage were suddenly unshackled. I saw an elderly woman, trembling as she rose, wrap her arms tightly around her neighbor, both of them crying uncontrollably. A young family embraced in the hallway, their child too young to understand, clapping along with the adults, wide-eyed with joy. At the courthouse, a silver-haired veteran covered his face, shoulders shaking with choked sob. He had once told me how he lived for years under the harassment of the HOA, threatened simply for flying a flag from his porch. Today, as he heard the 20-year sentence for Barbara Steele and the order to dissolve the HOA police, cried like a child, finally releasing the bitterness carried for so long. Hugs spread from one person to another as Oak Ridge residents reached for each other, needing to confirm that they were truly awake. One person clutched another tightly, passing along the feeling of safety. Red-rimmed eyes, tightly gripped hands, each of them said the same thing. We've walked through the dark, and now, we are truly free. I stood in the midst of it all, listening to the blend of clapping and crying, feeling my heart sink, and then rise again with a newfound justice wasn't some distant concept. It was right here, in the tears and the broken laughter. Every tear carried away the years of anguish, and every smile held the belief in a different future. Maya stood beside me, her eyes shining, her face calm, but I saw the pride in her gaze. She had faced a gun, exposed the truth, and held her ground through the darkest day. I turned to her, looked into her eyes, letting the emotion rise. Justice won, finally, I said slowly, each word a confirmation of everything we had endured. Maya smiled, not with triumph, but with peace. She took my hand, gave it a gentle squeeze, a reply that said everything. In her eyes, I saw a calm she hadn't known in a long time, and the light of renewed belief. In that moment, I understood that it wasn't just Maya or my family. Every soul in Oak Ridge finally found justice. As we stepped out of the courtroom, the afternoon light poured down, illuminating faces still streaked with tears, glowing with joy. The people of Oak Ridge lingered in the courtyard, embracing, shaking hands, exchanging words of gratitude. No longer did they look at one another with fear. In its place was unity and trust. Everyone understood that from this day forward, Oak Ridge was no longer a place ruled by fear, but a place where justice had been reclaimed through a collective voice. I took a deep breath, lifting my eyes to the sky, now clearing after a long and brutal storm, and within me, the words echoed once more, sharp and certain. Justice had won, and that was the perfect ending to everything we had endured. After the sentence was delivered and the HOA police disbanded, Oak Ridge entered a morning unlike any before. The black carts that once roamed the streets with impunity had vanished, leaving the roads wide and quiet. No longer did residents lower their heads or step aside at the sight of black vests. No longer did the roar of engines remind them who claimed control. The oppressive air that had lingered for years began to lift, placed by a lightness that showed in every footstep. I stepped out of my house, looking up at the familiar view that now felt entirely new. The white picket fence next door no longer had violation notices pinned to it, and many lawns bloomed with wildflowers, untamed and bright, because no one dared stop them anymore. Everything seemed to breathe again after so long being strangled. Laughter echoed from the far end of the street, children ran freely, and balloons bounced across the brick path. A simple sound, but in Oak Ridge today, it was a declaration of rebirth. Adults gathered in small groups, chatting and laughing with an ease I hadn't seen in years. An elderly man sat on a wooden chair on his porch, raising his coffee mug, his face at peace. A young family lays a blanket on their lawn, letting their baby crawl in the sunlight. These ordinary images carried extraordinary weight because they proved that Oak Ridge had broken free from the shadow of false authority. Maya walked beside me, her gaze softened. She watched the children chasing one another and smiled gently. "This," she said, "this is what we're supposed to be living for." I took her hand, feeling the calm return with every breath. The wounds had not yet healed, but at least we could finally see the light beyond the storm. That evening, residents gathered at the Central Park. They brought food, folding chairs, and everyone was buzzing with energy. A small, impromptu celebration took place. No speeches, no slogan, just people who had once lived in fear, now choosing to celebrate freedom. Music played from an old speaker, children danced, and adults sang along. I looked around and saw faces glowing in the soft light, tears of joy streaming down cheeks with no need to be hidden. A woman stood and spoke, her voice shaky but firm with resolve. "We've taken back Oak Ridge, and no one will ever force us to live in fear again." The applause was thunderous, echoing across the park, and I realized the real change wasn't just that the HOA police were gone. It was in the people of Oak Ridge themselves. They had learned how to raise their voices, and more importantly, how to stand together against injustice. Night fell, but Oak Ridge was no longer dark. The lights from the houses glowed warmly, reflecting a shared belief in a new beginning. Maya and I sat on a stone bench, silent for a long while. I thought about the road we had traveled, about the moment a gun was pressed to Maya's head, about the threatening letters, the lowered eyes. Now it was all just memory, a painful one, full of meaning, because it had led us to this day. Oak Ridge's new dawn was more than morning sunlight. It was a rebirth within the souls of every resident. We had paid a price, had faced our fears, but what we gained was true freedom. And as I listened to the sound of laughter drifting down the street, I knew that Oak Ridge had finally reclaimed the meaning of the word community. The morning after the trial, Maya and I decided to walk through the neighborhood. The familiar street, once stained with dread, now seemed wrapped in something new. The black carts were gone. The shouting that once stopped people mid-step had vanished, and no more suspicious glances came from those who once claimed to be the law. In their place were gently swaying trees in the early breeze, birdsong, and the friendly smiles of neighbors stepping out of their home. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, Oak Ridge felt truly peaceful. Maya walked beside me, her hand holding mine tighter. With each step, we saw evidence of the neighborhood's transformation. Children ran along the sidewalk, laughing as their ball bounced into the grass. Adults talked freely, no longer guarded when the HOA was mentioned. Everything felt ordinary, simple, but in that simplicity was the proof that Oak Ridge had emerged from the shadow. As we passed a small house, an elderly woman rose slowly from her porch, her eyes brimming. She said nothing, only nodded, her trembling smile carrying all the gratitude she couldn't put into words. Moments later, a middle-aged man who had been harassed by the HOA more times than I could count approached me and reached out his hand. His voice was hoarse. "If it weren't for you two, I don't know how much longer we could have held on." In his eyes, I saw a kind of gratitude I'd never seen in Oak Ridge before. Along the path, we came across a group of young people repairing an old swing in the park. When they saw Maya, they stopped, clapped, and burst into laughter. One of them called out, "Thank you for making us believe that justice still exists." Maya simply smiled, saying nothing, but I knew those words had reached her. Because through it all, she hadn't fought for glory. She fought so this entire community could believe again. Every gaze we met along the way was filled with gratitude. There were the bright eyes of carefree children, the tear-filled eyes of the elderly who had endured too much, and the silent nods from quiet men. All of it flowed together into one current. Recognition and thanks directed at us, and especially at Maya, who had dared to stand tall in front of a loaded gun. We walked slowly, watching Oak Ridge come back to life piece by piece. Conversations drifted along the sidewalk. Hammers echoed as someone rebuilt a broken gate, and the sound of a guitar spilled from a nearby home. These were familiar sounds, long absent, now returning with vibrant energy. I looked at Maya and caught the soft joy in her eye. She said quietly, "Peace, real peace, it's finally here." I squeezed her hand, overwhelmed by a feeling I couldn't name. There were times I thought Oak Ridge would never escape the grip it was trapped in. But today, as I looked into the grateful faces lining the street, I knew we had done it. And more importantly, this community had reclaimed its own freedom, together. That afternoon, the residents of Oak Ridge gathered at the community hall. There were no more cold rows of chairs under the scrutiny of the old board. This time, everyone arrived with a different mindset. Each person wanted to contribute, and each was eager to help rebuild the place called home. On the moderator's table, there was no longer a special seat for Barbara Steele or her enforcer, but instead, a handwritten sign. New association, transparent and fair. I sat beside Maya, looking around the room, feeling the unmistakable revival in every pair of eyes. We began to discuss forming a new association, one where every decision must be made publicly and recorded, where every financial transaction must be transparent. A group of volunteers, including residents with backgrounds in finance and law, was elected to oversee operations, with no one granted unchecked authority. The atmosphere in the room buzzed with energy. Some spoke, others took note, each person determined to ensure Oak Ridge never again slipped into the shadows of its past. In the midst of the discussion, a frail elderly woman stood up. She had lived in Oak Ridge for over 20 years and had silently endured more than most. Her voice trembled, but rang clear. "We've been silent for too long. For years, we allowed a small group to impose rule, intimidate, and strip us of our dignity. Today, we must promise each other never to let that happen again." Her words brought the room to a standstill, followed by an immediate and prolonged wave of applause. Maya looked at me, her eyes alight. I knew she was thinking the same thing. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a turning point. The silence had been broken, and with the return of their voices, Oak Ridge finally belonged to its people again. A young man stood up to follow. "We've seen what fear looks like now, we choose what fairness looks like. This new association must not resemble the old one. It must serve, not rule." His words prompted many nods, and several people quickly jotted notes into the draft charter. The meeting stretched into the evening, but no one seemed tired. On the contrary, the more they talked, the stronger their spirits grew. They discussed launching a public financial website, holding transparent election, and even organizing a summer festival to help heal the community. Laughter echoed through the hall, a rare sound I had never heard during all the years under the rule of the former HOA. When the meeting ended, neighbors shook hands, their smiles replacing the suspicion that had long shrouded Oak Ridge. I stepped out of the hall with Maya, feeling a lightness in my chest. The community's voice had finally been raised, strong strong and unified. I knew that from this moment on, Oak Ridge would no longer be haunted by the shadow of false authority, but would instead be guided by the light of transparency and fairness. The atmosphere in the hall, as the meeting drew to a close, was nothing like the quiet resignation of the past. From the front row to the back, every Oak Ridge resident wore a radiant expression, eyes lit with renewed hope. I stood up, feeling dozens of eyes waiting for a final word, emotion rising in my chest. All the months of struggle, all the danger that had nearly pushed my family to the brink, had become the foundation for an entire community to rise. I took a deep breath, my voice ringing through the wide room. No one stands above the law. The words rang out with finality, holding the room in silence for a moment before the applause thundered in. I emphasized each syllable, so they would remember that justice is not a privilege, it is a foundation. Barbara Steele and the entire machine beneath her collapsed because they believed false power could replace the law. But today, in front of everyone, I wanted them to understand that the era was over. The law is not for display, nor is it a tool for the powerful to bend. It exists to protect every person in this room. When the applause subsided, Maya stepped up beside me. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp, and her voice rang out with unwavering clarity. A gun cannot crush dignity. The hall erupted. Middle-aged men gripped hands tightly, women wiped away tears, and the younger ones shouted in agreement. Maya's words echoed the moment she faced that barrel. When someone pretending to be a police officer believed a weapon alone could make the people of Oak Ridge prisoners of fear. But they were wrong, because once dignity is defended, it is stronger than any weapon. An elderly woman stood, her voice choked firm. We will not be silent anymore. Someone else followed. We will watch over each other, and never let anyone turn Oak Ridge into a prison again. The words echoed, filling the air with determination. I looked around and saw faces that once bowed in fear now lift confident and united. That is the greatest power of all, something no dictator can ever take. We agreed to elect a new oversight board, implement transparent financial regulation, and most importantly, let residents decide every matter directly. This time, no one would impose control, no one could exploit fear to rule. Everyone pledged to remember the two statements just spoken. The law is supreme, and dignity is inviolable. These principles were not just for Oak Ridge, they were for any community that had suffered under the abuse of HOA power. When the meeting ended, people stood and applauded without pause, their cheers echoing through the entire hall. A war veteran came up to shake my hand, his voice hoarse. You were right. No one stands above the law. Thanks to you both, we finally believed. Maya simply smiled, but her eyes glowed with pride. I knew for her, this wasn't a personal victory, it was a victory for all of Oak Ridge. Stepping outside, the night sky was bathed in soft moonlight, the breeze rustling through the trees with a calming touch. Maya and I walked side by side, listening to the sound of laughter rising from families gathered on their front lawn, simple sounds filled with deep meaning. Oak Ridge had finally reclaimed what it meant to be alive. No more the haunting presence of black cart, no more the threatening stares from self-declared police. Now, there was only the sound of people, of laughter, and the steady belief that true justice exists. What do you think communities should do to stand up against HOA abuse? Share your thoughts in the comments. After everything Oak Ridge has been through, I've come to truly understand something I never fully realized before. Silence is complicity. For years, the residents here lived under the grip of the HOA, enduring citation letters, threatening stares, and high-pressure meetings. They knew it was wrong, but chose to look the other way just to keep peace. I was one of them, believing that staying silent would make it all pass, but it didn't. That silence became fertile ground for those in power to plant fear and injustice. It wasn't until a gun was pointed at Maya's head that I realized how dangerously close that silence had brought us to the edge. Maya told me many times that the most terrifying thing isn't the gun, power placed in the wrong hand. The most frightening thing isn't the weapon, it's misplaced authority, she once said in a meeting. Those words echoed in me for a long time. A gun can take a life, but when power is misused, it can destroy an entire community, forcing people to live in darkness for years, stripping away dignity until no voice is left. It was that misplaced authority that convinced men in black vests they stood above the law, that they could aim a weapon at a woman of color and never face consequence. Looking back at the old Oak Ridge, I saw a community turned into obedient sheep, kind neighbors, hard-working family, all forced to nod along with the HOA. Only when Maya fought back, when the evidence came to light, did everyone realize silence protects no one. It only prolongs the nightmare and emboldens the oppressor. The lesson about dignity wasn't just Maya's, it was an awakening for all of us. In the days after the trial, I often overheard residents speaking in a tone I hadn't heard before. No more fearful whispers, but open conversations about overseeing the new association, about voting rights, about protecting one another. An older man who used to be bullied by the HOA said he finally felt relieved because he'd found the courage to stand up and stop bowing his head. A young family said they would teach their children to defend their voice, never to let anyone take their dignity away. I've come to realize dignity is the deepest foundation of any community. You can lose money, property, even your home, but when dignity is stripped away and you remain silent, that is the greatest loss of all. Maya taught me that, not just through word, but by the way she stood tall with a gun to her head, unyielding, unafraid, and without begging. In that moment, she wasn't just defending herself, she was defending the dignity of everyone who witnessed it. And I understand now that justice doesn't descend from above, it begins with small, decisive act. One person brave enough to speak, one honest statement, one piece of evidence when joined together, create collective power. Oak Ridge proved that. From a single recorded video, from the first round of applause, the entire community reclaimed its voice. And once that voice was raised, the illusion of power collapsed quickly as a sandcastle meeting the tide. Now, as I walk down the sunlit street, hearing the sound of children playing and neighbors greeting one another, I know Oak Ridge has changed. But what matters more than the surface-level peace is the deeper awareness of dignity that has taken root. People now understand that silence is no longer an option, that power must be held accountable, and that the law stands above all. It's a bitter lesson, but a necessary one, to ensure Oak Ridge never again falls under the grip of those who masquerade as justice. Maya walks beside me, her hand gripping mine firmly. I hear her voice echo once more. The most frightening thing isn't the gun, it's power in the wrong hand. I nod, a new sense of belief rising in me. We've come through the darkness, and it was dignity that lit the way back to the light. Maya's words that day in court, the most frightening thing isn't the gun, it's power in the wrong hand, quickly broke beyond the courthouse wall. News outlets clipped the moment, played it on national television, and social media spread it like wildfire. I opened my phone to find the quote in hundreds of posts, alongside images of Maya standing tall, her gaze sharp, proud. People shared it not just as an indictment, but as a solemn reminder of how easily power can be abused. Major newspapers used the quote as a headline, calling Maya the woman who exposed the HOA police. Online, memes appeared with bold white text against black background. Misplaced power is more dangerous than a gun. Each share, each comment turned the phrase into an unspoken anthem. One social commentator wrote that it wasn't a political statement, but a philosophy on dignity and justice. From Oak Ridge, the words spread out, becoming part of broader conversations on abuse of power in other communities. At the local market, someone recognized, stepped forward, and said, "I heard your wife on television." That line stayed with me. A veteran took my hand, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, we faced guns on the battlefield, but injustice at home weighs heavier." I listened, realizing that Maya's words had reached deep into people's memories and experiences, far beyond Oak Ridge's own story. In Oak Ridge itself, the phrase wasn't just repeated, it became a way of life. The local school posted it on their bulletin board, and teachers used it to teach students about civic responsibility. A group of young residents made a banner and hung it in the Central Park, the bold lettering visible to all who passed by. At meetings of the new association, residents often began by repeating those words, as a pledge never to repeat the past. One elderly woman said to me at a meeting, "We stayed silent for too long." Now that quote reminds us all that power must always walk hand in hand with transparency. I looked around and saw heads nodding, eyes filled with resolve. Dignity was no longer some distant concept. It had become the guiding principle for every action, from managing shared budgets to how we treat our neighbors. Maya never liked being praised, but I could clearly see she understood the weight of those words. She only offered a faint smile whenever someone quoted her, yet her eyes sparkled with conviction. I knew she hadn't spoken to be admired. She spoke because it was what she believed, what she had lived and acted upon. That sincerity is what gave the words their power, what made the people of Oak Ridge choose them as their new guiding principle. And I believe, with those words, Oak Ridge will never return to the old path. They are a tether and a mark, a reminder that whenever someone tries to overstep their bounds, the entire community will rise and speak out. From one tense courtroom, a single sentence became a beacon, keeping Oak Ridge in the light of justice and dignity. Barbara Steele, who once sat atop the HOA board with a haughty expression and a voice that suppressed an entire community, now sits quietly in an orange prison jumpsuit. The false aura that once cloaked her has dissolved, leaving behind a gaunt figure, head bowed, in a cramped cell. There are no more meetings where she banged the table and barked orders, no more henchmen in black vests strutting around with menace, only four cold walls and the solitude that gnaws with each passing day. For the residents of Oak Ridge, that image is the clearest proof that justice, at last, knows how to knock. News outlets reported that Barbara now faces not only a 20-year federal prison sentence, but also the scorn of the very people who once lived under her reign. The local press published a series of letters from former residents, each line written with bitterness and fury. One person wrote, "You turned our homes into prison. Now, you have one of your own." Another wrote, "Thank you for teaching me that silence only feeds evil. Now stay silent in your cell for the next 2 decades." I read those letters and felt each word slice through Barbara's former self-importance like a blade. She once believed the residents would always bow their head, but once freed, it was they who spoke the loudest. They didn't need to scream or curse. Each letter sent to her prison was enough to make her confront everything she had done. At one of the new HOA meetings, an elderly man stood and shakily read aloud the letter he had sent Barbara. "You made me so afraid I couldn't even hang the American flag on my porch. Now I hang it every day, and you hang your despair inside a prison cell. That's what you deserve." When he finished, the room fell silent, followed by a long round of applause, not loud or raucous, but deeply resonant. Maya heard the news and offered only a faint, cold smile. She didn't celebrate, but in her eyes was a quiet acknowledgement. The wheel of justice crushed the woman who once believed herself untouchable. She whispered to me, "Sometimes the harshest punishment isn't the sentence. It's when she realizes no one respects her anymore, only curses remain." I nodded, because it was true. There's no collapse more humiliating than being rejected by the very community you once ruled. Those letters, those seemingly simple words, became a sentence far longer than 20 years. And for the people of Oak Ridge, that was the justice they truly deserved. The news that Barbara Steele had officially entered federal prison spread through Oak Ridge faster than any HOA notice ever had. Unlike the fear that once followed violation letters or threats, this time, people whispered with relief. Many even smiled openly. On front porches, in coffee shop, at the town's Central Park, the phrase repeated more than any other was, "She had it coming." I walked down the street, overhearing a group of older residents chatting. An elderly man, long harassed by the HOA, let out a dry laugh, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Turns out she couldn't stand above the law after all. She made us live in fear for years. Now she finally knows what it means to be locked up." The people around him nodded. Some even burst out laughing, the kind of laughter that carried the sweetness of release after a long and bitter journey. Inside the corner store, the shopkeeper, once quiet and cautious, spoke more boldly now. As she stocked shelves, she told a customer, "As long as Barbara was out there, I was still afraid. But now, it's over. She got exactly what she deserved." Her words rang out firm, no longer whispered, but a collective declaration. I saw shoppers laugh freely. The air in the tiny shop lightened with relief. Maya walked beside me, listening in calm silence. She didn't say a word, but I caught the faint lift of her lip. It wasn't joy in the simple sense, but a recognition that the pain and fear residents once endured had finally been answered with justice. Every time someone said, "She got what she deserved," it echoed like a shared anthem, a confirmation that the dark era had truly ended. That evening, during the community meeting, when one person stood and declared, "We can hold our heads high because justice has won," the entire room erupted in applause. I looked around and saw it, the unmistakable gleam of satisfaction in every gaze. There was no more caution, no lingering doubt. Instead, confidence, pride, and the joy of having shed a burden long carried lit up every face. I remembered the days when Oak Ridge was cloaked in fear, when residents avoided eye contact and kept silent under pressure. Compared to now, the contrast was striking. Their eyes now burned bright like flame, glowing with the triumph they had waited years to feel. This wasn't just about Barbara being punished. It was a powerful reaffirmation that their dignity had never been lost, only buried, and now it had returned in full brilliance. I squeezed Maya's hand and whispered, "Found themselves again." She nodded, eyes scanning the room full of radiant faces. Yes, Barbara paid the price, but the real reward belonged to the people of Oak Ridge. And in every shining look that night, I saw an unspoken vow. Never again would they let anyone crush their dignity. The story of Oak Ridge finally came to a close on a peaceful afternoon. On the street once patrolled by the relentless rumble of black carts, there were now only the relaxed footsteps of residents and the clear, joyful laughter of children. I stood on the porch, watching sunlight stretch across the sidewalk, thinking back on the chaos we had endured. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary morning, but when a gun was aimed at Maya's head, Oak forced to confront the truth. And from that moment on, we were silent no more. I remembered the pale faces in those meetings, the downcast eyes afraid of being targeted, the unjust fines that drove families to sell the homes they loved. All of it became a heavy shadow on our memory, but also the fuel for change. When justice was finally spoken in court, when Barbara Steele was sentenced, we could finally breathe. Yet more than the verdict, what mattered most was that Oak Ridge had learned to rise, had learned how to reclaim the dignity that had been trampled. I turned to Maya, her eyes still unwavering after everything. "Slowly," I said, "justice sometimes begins with the courage to stand up." It wasn't a grand speech, just a quiet truth I'd come to realize through this fight. If the residents had remained silent, if we hadn't insisted on exposing the darkness would have lingered. One action, one voice, that's all it took to shake the system. And when many voices came together, justice finally had a chance to speak. Maya smiled, a quiet smile sharp as steel. She replied, "And from never surrendering to what's unreasonable." That sentence captured everything we had lived through. When faced with a gun, she didn't tremble. When threatened, she didn't bow her head. That refusal to yield gave the community the courage to face the truth, to rediscover its own voice. I knew that for Maya, justice wasn't just a ruling, it was a way of living, a refusal to accept the unreasonable as a normal part of life. That evening, the residents of Oak Ridge gathered once more at the Central Park. They brought food, folding chairs, and their children played around the fountain. Music played, conversation flowed. No one brought up the past day, but in every glance, I saw pride and gratitude. People greeted one another with smiles, shook hands like companions who had survived a long storm together. I sat with Maya under the big tree, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves, feeling peace settle deep. This story did not end in revenge, but in justice and renewed faith. We had learned that silence feeds cruelty, while a voice, even a small one, can become lightning that cuts through the dark. Oak Ridge had changed, and I believed it would never go back to what it once was, because every resident had come to understand the value of dignity, had etched into their memory that justice always begins with the courage to stand up and with the choice to never surrender to the unreasonable. When the community meetings came to an end, when the small flags were planted in front yards in place of the old fear, I realized the story of Oak Ridge had truly come to a close. Closure doesn't mean disappearance. It's like a bell that's been struck. The echo lingers long in the minds of those who heard it. Children still play freely on the sidewalk. Adults chat outside their home. But whenever someone mentions the name Barbara Steele, there's a moment of remembering the dark time, and with it, a deeper appreciation for the freedom they now have. Maya and I have been asked many times, what made you not back down? I usually just smile, and Maya always answers simply, because dignity can't be bought, and it can't be traded. Maybe that's why this story is more than just a memory, it's become a shared legacy of Oak Ridge. Anyone who has ever lived in this community understands that justice is not a gift handed out. It comes from the courage to stand against the unreasonable. The press eventually moved on, reporters chasing other stories. But for us, the echo remained. Every time I walk past the old HOA office, now abandoned and sealed off, I feel a strange kind of pride rise in me. A place that once stood as a symbol of intimidation is now just a cold, hollow shell. It serves as living proof that any abuser of power, no matter how untouchable they once seemed, will eventually fall to the truth. In porch conversation, residents often recall the biggest lesson Oak Ridge ever taught: don't stay silent. A woman who once barely spoke now tells her neighbors boldly that if anyone ever abuses power again, she'll be the first to rise. That line always makes me smile, because I know the echo of this story isn't just a memory. It's become a driving force in how people choose to live with one another. Maya stays quiet whenever someone calls her a symbol, but I can see in her eyes the unshakable belief she carries. She knows this was never just our fight, it belonged to everyone who helped break the chain. She once whispered to me, "What matters isn't that we won, it's that we never bowed our head." I believe those words will live on for many years, passed down to the generations after us, and I want to end all of this with one simple, resonant reminder: whether it's the HOA or any other force that abuses power, it will fall. They may seem strong for a time, may sow fear and silence others, but in the end, the truth always finds a way. The price Barbara Steele had to pay is the clearest proof of that. Oak Ridge witnessed, Oak Ridge stood up, and Oak Ridge won. Our story may end here, but its echoes will live on in every smile, in every confident glance of the people. And anyone who hears it will understand this. Justice is always present, waiting only for someone brave enough to call it by name. The story of Oak Ridge, seen from beginning to end, resembles a long journey through dark, yet lit by the courage of ordinary. It all began on what seemed like a peaceful morning, when Maya simply went out for a run. A routine act turned into a nightmare when men posing as HOA police blocked her path, hurled racist insults, and eventually pointed a gun at her head. In that moment, it wasn't just Maya. Every resident of Oak Ridge pushed to the edge of what they could endure. But instead of collapsing, Maya resisted, proving that no one has the right to force others to live in fear. From that incident, long-buried secrets began to crack open. A video taken by a bystander spread far beyond Oak Ridge, becoming a national flash. The country saw the truth. A small homeowners association had created its own armed force and declared itself above the law. The story no longer centered on a single family under threat. It became a warning of what unchecked power can become when silence is allowed to fester. As social media erupted, Oak Ridge residents realized, for the first time, that they were no longer alone. Outrage spread, and long-forgotten stories resurfaced about banned flags, homes forcibly sold for next to nothing. The crescendo came when internal evidence was exposed: emails ordering surveillance of black residents, shady financial records, and weapons traced to the black market stripped away every last thread of Barbara Steele's false authority. The woman who once strode into meetings with an air of dominion now stood revealed as the ringleader of a criminal syndicate masquerading as a community board. It all culminated in a public hearing where the entire nation witnessed Maya affirm her identity, not as a victim, but as a Delta Force officer, reminding everyone that the greatest threat is not the gun, power placed in the wrong hand. Her words rang out, far beyond the courtroom, becoming a quote repeated across the country, instilling in millions the lesson that justice only survives when dignity comes first. When true justice spoke, the 20-year federal prison sentence for Barbara Steele was not merely a punishment for one individual, but a liberation for an entire community. The HOA police force was disbanded, permanently declared an illegal organization. The residents of Oak Ridge walked out of the courthouse with tears of relief, relief, embracing each other in the joy of emancipation. From the eyes that once stared at the ground in fear, they now looked up, letting the light of freedom wash over them. Oak Ridge didn't just win a lawsuit. They conquered the fear that had shackled them for far too long. But more important than any verdict was the transformation within each resident. They had learned that silence meant complicity. Justice doesn't arrive unless someone dares to act. In meetings to form a new association, they agreed that every decision must be transparent, every expense publicly recorded, and above all, no one should ever hold absolute power again. Frail, elderly woman stood up, voice trembling, and admitted, "We were silent for too long." And that single sentence became the guiding principle for a community that had just reclaimed its voice. Maya, though uncomfortable with recognition, became the unexpected symbol of resolve. She didn't fight to be celebrated. She fought because she believed dignity could not be trampled. When her words, "A gun cannot crush dignity," were repeated, Oak Ridge residents didn't just applaud, they adopted them as a way of life. Schools used them to teach civic responsibility, and parks displayed the phrase as a reminder to all who pass. It was no longer just a statement from a hearing. It had become the shared spirit of a community to defend dignity against all misplaced power. Barbara Steele is now nothing more than a name synonymous with disgrace. In prison, she receives letters of condemnation from the very residents she once threatened. Each letter is a verdict in its own right, a reminder that her false glory has vanished, leaving only isolation and contempt. And in every word of those curses, the people of Oak Ridge found a fitting sense of satisfaction. No one trembles at the name Barbara anymore. Instead, they whisper to each other with confidence, "She got what she deserved." The greatest lesson of Oak, looking back on the entire story, isn't about legal victory or the fall of a petty tyrant. It lies in the awakening of a community. The people understood that justice begins when someone dares to rise, and that dignity only survives when we refuse to accept injustice as normal. This is not a distant tale. It is something any community might face when power is placed in the wrong hand, and when silence becomes the barrier to truth. Maya and I can now stroll along sun-drenched street, hear the laughter of children, and see eyes filled with gratitude. But more than the peace itself, what gives me the deepest sense of trust is the message Oak Ridge has sent to the world. HOA, or any entity that abuses power, will eventually fall. Truth can be buried temporarily, but light cannot be extinguished. And as I said during the final meeting, justice sometimes begins with the courage to stand up, Maya added, and with never yielding to injustice. Two simple sentences, yet they are the distilled essence of Oak Ridge's entire journey. The story ends, but its echo remains. It is not just a memory of a struggle, but a guiding light for anyone who has ever believed they were too small to make a difference. Because the truth is, all it takes is one person to rise, and the whole community can reclaim its voice, and in the end, justice will prevail.